Something a little bit different for you this week. Back in December, I had the incredible honour of walking through Iain Sinclair's exhibition at Swedenborg House, Histories and Hauntings. You may have, with Iain and the museum director and curator Stephen McNeilly, you would have seen them in a walk, or hopefully you saw them in a walk we did about a year ago, where we walked through Swedenborg's London. And this exhibition, though, is largely based on a legendary exhibition that Iain put on at the Whitechapel Gallery in 1974 with a group of friends, including Brian Catling, Renchi Bicknell, who did the London Orbital Walk with Iain. And really, the things in that exhibition laid the foundation for all of what you see on this channel here, all the themes, some of which might be called what we now call sort of psychogeography in this country, but this idea of like walking ancient trackways, looking for oddities in sort of unpromising parts of the city, obelisks and that kind of thing, alignments of churches and all of that. The map that that Brian Catling drew, I should say, from Iain's notes, of a kind of alignments of London has been hugely influential in the way that people look at cities and look at London, and all the kind of earth mysteries with urbanism and all of that kind of stuff, poetry, art. It was all in that exhibition in '74, and that set down a template that people like myself are still following to this day. So to walk through that exhibition with Iain and get the whole story was incredible, and with Stephen, with his great knowledge of the city and of Swedenborg and philosophy, it was one of the most fascinating conversations I think I've ever had the honour to film. And that's what we're going to do now. We're going to go through the exhibition, stay with it. Some of the best bits are towards the end, and like I say, it's a bit different, but I love having the opportunity to do things like this. So it's a real honour to have the opportunity to do things like this. So yeah, hope you enjoy it. I won't say hope you enjoy it as much as I did, but I hope you enjoy it and find it enlightening.
We're in Swedenborg House. We're upstairs in the upper chamber, and we're gonna walk through this exhibition called Histories and Hauntings. And the history really goes back. We're in a movement in time. It goes back to Whitechapel Gallery in 1974, when three young, naive, overreaching poet-painters who were involved with Albion Village Press, a small press which I did, walked into the Whitechapel Gallery and asked to have space to put on an exhibition. Because at that time, the forces were all amazingly centrifugal. We were bedded down in a communal house in Hackney, but we were constantly breaking off to make expeditions to stone circles, traveling all around the country. And there was a photographic record of that, of mine largely. There were many drawings by Brian Catling, who was essentially a sculptor at that time. He'd just gone to the Royal College of Art as a student. And Renchi Bicknell was a painter, visionary, and an immense walker, and all of us had accumulated a lot of material, but it seemed to knit together in a certain way. And Brian and I were both working in Truman's Brewery in Brick Lane, and after we'd had our morning pints of porter, we used to wander the territories, map out the labyrinth, and we walked into the Whitechapel Gallery one day and said, "We're local, you support local arts, can we have a room?" I'll read you what the response was. It's on the lectern down there. So after we'd been into the Whitechapel Gallery, they said, can you send us an official proposal? And this is what I said. We take Blake's Jerusalem, the emanations of the giant Albion, as a metaphor and a starting point. Landscape, geology, myth, image, totem. We would present the available environment as far as possible in sacred terms. Use of the space available, colour. We would include the Gower Peninsula, Wiltshire, the Ridgeway, Avebury, the Yorkshire Moors, North Wales, Northumberland, walks taken, ancient tracks. These images are cold, objective, non-human, recordings of rock clues, megalithic playback, photographs that reprint images from the films. We hope to present showings of related film material and perhaps readings by poets. On the 7th of December in 1973, there was a response from the gallery and the Arts Council about funding. Dear Iain Sinclair, thank you for your letter. On a quick look through your proposal, I do feel that it is too mystical for our taste. You can certainly have the space as we arranged, but I'm afraid to tell you that the coffers are bare. If you will forgive the phrase, and we are really rather stuck, perhaps you could let me know as soon as possible what you feel about this. Yours sincerely, Jenny Stein.
Fantastic.
But what we're coming into before this is that a bunch of people have settled in the East End of London. Three of them who were in the photograph cabinets and so on were myself, Renchi Bicknell and Tom Baker, all of whom wanted to make film. Tom Baker had written Witchfinder General and The Sorceress for Mike Rees, so he was successful at that moment. Renchi was working out at the BBC editing Sherlock Holmes stories, and I'd made a documentary for West German television on Allen Ginsberg and was in the process of communicating with William Burroughs about a follow-up when he decided he was going to go into Scientology. And this period where this show is emerges from what happens after that. We all decided independently that that engagement with the mainstream was only sucking up your energies. Renchi and I were actually writing a script on Conan the Conqueror, of which a few fragments emerged in the final film. Tom was working on the Alfred Hitchcock Hour, and he had a terrible thing of he had to take in his script to this ferocious woman who was the Hitchcock representative, who marked it like homework. And if she didn't like it, she just scratched it out. If she gave a little red tick, then he got paid for those bits. And a few months of that was the end. You know, he couldn't do it anymore. We'd seen some films by Stan Brakhage and Jonas Mekas, and we decided we were going to just do our own films, 8mm. We were going to publish our own books, started a small press, Albion Village Press, and we were going to strike off and make these expeditions, sometimes long ones, sometimes short ones, keep a record of it, and make a show, which is the remnant of which is here now. But it's traveled through time, and it's picked up accretions along the way. But essentially, we're not showing any of the contemporary work or the latter work of Brian Catling, which is immense and can be seen in an Arena documentary, or the many, many notebooks and sketchbooks that Renchi has produced in the meanwhile. It's all about that one period, the beginning, the start of it all in 1974. So back in the days, in late 60s, early 70s, there was this sort of diary record of these people's lives, as if there was some sense of excitement in being in this place. And the controversial one was this photograph here of this is actually the Whitechapel Gallery before our show when we were looking at it. And two people who were published by Albion Village Press, Renchi Bicknell and Tony Lowes, decided they were going to run around this spiral made by Richard Long, which represents Silbury Hill, which we were actually just about to walk to. And people are going, oh my God, you're defacing an artwork. But that's what they did, and I caught them. And years later, when Renchi is now in his Peruvian cap, which he always wears, came back to Hackney, he has in his hands, you notice, a photograph of the troupe that are about to set off to walk from Streatley down the Ridgeway to Avebury and to Silbury Hill. So that's that. And then I wanted, because the original show was called Albion Island Vortex, and I saw in a text of Michael Moorcock's, in my skulls a multiplicity of spheres, an infinity of Albions. I thought that was it. So he stands over the door in that sort of Blakean sense. When this sword of Brian's it had been kept purposely wrapped up in old sacking, and I'd twice taken it out to bury it, and each time it refused to be buried. I took it down to Montacute because of its connection with Waltham Abbey. There was a cross that was excavated in Montacute and given to some oxen who led it on a diagonal journey. Where they stopped, they founded Waltham Abbey. So I kind of reversed it, took this back down to there from Waltham Abbey, but it couldn't be buried. And it came back, and this is the first time it's revealed. And as it was put in that case, the roof of the building fell in. So the building is so sensitive to the stuff that's in it. Yeah, this is Steve Dilworth's Sacred Heart, which is quite a story in itself of how it was made. Dilworth was Brian Catling's oldest friend, really. They met at Maidstone doing a foundation course, which they both left early for various reasons, and have stayed in touch, even though Steve has worked up in the Isle of Harris. Brian's been all over the place, finally near Oxford. There's a dialogue between those two, and Brian introduced me to Steve, and we became friends, and he gave me this piece after I'd written something about him, and it's a piece with the same sort of power as Brian, and putting the two together, that's okay. And the idea is that you use this room to walk around in the way that we did these journeys. You go into the smaller room, which is like a cave of poetry, and then you move upstairs, which is another thing we'll come to. The idea, I think, was, if it was a walk, it starts more or less, well, either there or here, and this is one of Renchi's travelling pilgrim paintings, which again at that time he was very taken with the importance of the geology. So while he's doing these walks, he would be picking up little stones which get stuck in, bits of chalk or whatever, and they're layered, and there are all kinds of movements of time through the journeys get circled in. So that was his sort of guiding signature that started the whole walk around the gallery, and it is also to do with flight, which seemed to be a secondary element. There's all kinds of images of flight, crows, etc. But it doesn't feel forced to me. It feels fairly. So then Brian was always making one-off books, very generous. You know, they were made objects that he laboured over, and then they were presented, and so they became really important. They're like signatures of things that have not yet happened, and may happen for him, may happen for you. And that kind of moves us then into one of the first sites, which is the Gower Peninsula, this amazingly alien limestone rock, which is very savage. And he and I did this walk to try and locate a cave where the Red Lady of Gower, so-called, was buried. So 30,000 years ago, and failed to do that. Kind of find more or less where the cave is, but we don't go into it, but it becomes something else. And Brian produced this particular drawing, which is his own rendering of this exact landscape, which is here. So we've got the kind of actual photographs. We've got a series of these very spindly and interesting drawings Brian did when he was in the Royal College, which he used to exhibit in a line with his sculptural environments. And there's a great photograph of these huge environments he used to make with a line of these images. So he's always kind of worked between drawing, sculpture and text, and so here you have the text he produced.
But these were part of the original Whitechapel show?
These were in the original Whitechapel show, as were those, as was this poem, which was in the original catalogue. This then is a much more recent. This wasn't in the original show. This is one of Renchi's drawings, but it's on the same spiritual tenure. And then finally another poem from Brian, going back to this landscape in Avebury that we'd walked many, many years before. Originally a walk that's recorded in this cabinet when the group from Hackney set off to walk down the Ridgeway. And I returned with Brian to look for a particular stone. He'd had some visionary experience when he was about 17 down there, and there was a stone that we were set off to find. And when we found the place where he thought it was, there was no stone, but there was a crow. And so he picked up the crow, which is also photographed there. And later I carried this crow on in a walk with Andrew Cotting from Waltham Abbey. Became Odo, which I carried with me. So then, kind of moving on the same way, there's a group of these little photographs were in the Whitechapel Gallery as representing these walks and landscapes, and these are pilgrim journeys that Renchi did later. This one was Brockenhurst New Forest, was in the original show,
Right.
And I've written about that in the catalogue, which is he sets off to walk in the forest. He gets completely lost. He thinks he's miles away, and he's only just outside Brockenhurst. And the interesting thing is that there's a journal entry from somebody who was a friend of Tennyson and remarks on him reading Swedenborg.
Oh, yes.
And
yes.
that when he said, and he arrives at Brockenhurst. So
Yes.
this all that one had to be in from
Yes.
the original show. And this is the beginning of Renchi left this house in Hackney. He reached a point with these Jungian paintings where he just felt he needed to step out and walk. He walked all the way to Swansea from Hackney. This is the first night in Richmond under this Blakean sky. And it took a boat to Ireland. Then he walked out to the west of Ireland. And in the west of the island, he has this psychedelic LSD experience, I think a unique one for him, in which again he floats into the cosmos and sees these animal forms and has a kind of vision that is basically changes his approach and his way of life. And he's not doing those same sort of paintings again. He's more or less becoming a seeker, spiritual seeker, and making these very specific pilgrimage journeys, one of which is a walk around the M25, which we did together. And then here we've got a bunch of things of Brian's. The bottom is from the film I made called Maggid Street, which Brian was playing the part of a surgeon who takes in a vagrant from the streets in the Old Kent Road and goes through a series of processes like alchemy to produce this angelic shamanistic form, which is and in fact the final operation, he draws a raven out of the head of this person, which is like the bird that recurs all along. The sword was just astonishing. It was a thing of incredible power. And I've never sort of hung it up anywhere or exhibited it in any way. It was actually under an old baggy sofa that people sat on, not knowing what was on it. And it points.
It's this incredibly charged object.
It's the charged object which gave the compass bearings of the whole show.
Yeah.
And I think when I was talking about it with Renchi, he thought this was the sort of defining thing that set up the alignments of the whole
alignment.
show. It's the alignment and the energy line that pours through, and it goes through the egg-like figure of Steve Dilworth and into the inner chamber of poetry.
Yeah.
And one that relates to that same series, Walking Through Wiltshire, the wood block that was the symbol of Albion Village Press.
Yes.
These are the productions of the actual books that we did, which look rather wonderful.
Yes.
A series of photo portraits of Brian's, the end of the walk down to Wayland Smithy, which Brian was writing about at the end, the Gower, and Brian with the crow. And in this cabinet are these sort of archival traces of all this. This is one specific walk, one of the first big walks that we did, and a real diary drawing kind of recording that.
I enjoyed that.
Then the ephemera from the Whitechapel Gallery.
Yeah.
So anyway, in we go to this.
But this
this
is
room
you.
is
Is this
perfect.
right in? This is you.
Oh yeah, that's me in the Cyclops series.
Yeah.
Very swollen bulb of a head. And then I thought because this room has such a wonderfully more intimate and skull-like quality, which fitted all this scatter of poetic inspirations that fitted around the time, like this labyrinthine set of drawings around which Renchi did for Kodak Mantra Diaries, the Ginsberg book I did. And these are like my own diary doodles of these, like climbing up an obelisk in St Luke's Old Street or circling around Cerne Abbas, whatever.
This passage, I find myself gravitating to this corner. I do a walk around every day just to make sure everything's in place, but to enjoy it. But I always do find myself gravitating to this little corner.
And this was the map, the original Ludheat map, which Brian drew out from my doodlings, which is quite an influential thing, and that's Martin Rowson's piss take on it all, which is quite funny, which is the kind of people who try to actually navigate through the real world with these mystical, not mystical enough And so the A to Z is a waste of money. Yeah.
But in a way, Brian's sword as well does also point to this.
Straight into this.
Yeah.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
So the sword goes into the map,
Yeah.
and then actually it comes out again because the last piece in the catalogue is when we walk to Pole Hill from Greenwich. We're standing at the obelisk, which you can see upstairs with the crow, and that sword is pushing this same line right through London. And then it's this sort of archive of these sort of poetic performances, reading for the launch of Downriver, discussing with Allen Ginsberg in Regent's Park, and the launch of Whitechapel Scarlet Tracings in the old operating theatre with Brian Catling.
Yeah.
And a little cluster of the more of the drawings that I was doing at that time, the writing of Downriver and Ludheath and so on.
So when did you stop? Or have you ever stopped?
No, I did sort of stop, I guess, round about that. That sort of mid-70s period, because I think because then I had to work for a living. 1975 I started as a book dealer.
Yeah.
So I had a stall in Islington, and basically it took all my time just to survive, because I'd be up at 5 o'clock in the morning on Thursday to set up the stall and do all that. Friday I'd go down to Portobello Road and buy, and then be on the stall. Saturday I'd go to Farringdon Road, and Sunday I was in Club Row at about 4 o'clock in the morning. And then Monday I was out on the road buying, and then the whole cycle start again. So there wasn't any time.
Right.
So there's this kind of magical period, I suppose, between 1968 and 1975, when all this stuff, this whole exhibition emerges from that.
Yeah.
And the culmination is the show in the Whitechapel Gallery and publication of Ludheath, which is this map.
Yeah.
And then, after that it's
became
reality. I think I had 7-8 years, and I just was working at books and maybe publishing occasionally something in 20 copies and giving it away, and that was it until 1987.
Wow. You got time to do some more?
I'd like to. Life would have to kind of...
I do really like these two. They're among my favourites in the show. For reasons that I can't fully explain, these frames are extraordinary objects.
It's incredible.
But there's a fantastic match between the frame and the image. I find
because the frames are what you buy for £3 or whatever. And I'm just like, I did a lot of these, but I didn't frame many.
Yeah.
But a couple, I'd buy a cheap frame and stick them in.
Yeah.
I've never put them up on the wall, but essentially they were good ways to sort of think about those. Sometimes you write something, sometimes you wanted a picture, and I just did that. And I suppose, being in close communication with Renchi, and he was doing those paintings all the time. I'd like to go back to it.
Yeah.
But it would be a different life.
Yes.
I wouldn't be able to do these things.
No.
I don't know. Why has it become so complicated that essentially we probably do less, but it takes more time?
Yeah.
So
probably more in demand as well.
I wasn't in demand. I wasn't in demand at all.
It's a good thing, isn't it, for work?
It was a good thing for work. That's certainly true. I mean, in all this, there was basically when I was a parks gardener, and I just when you'd made enough to stop, just stop for 2 months or 3 months and go away and write and paint and do those things and take the photographs. But that's not feasible anymore.
No.
But what I really, this has been the most sort of human of shows that I've tried to do things along this line several times.
Right.
Like in Slaughterhouse in Smithfield in the cellars.
Yeah.
And in that case, it was sort of like this. These photographs were there. But the woman in charge painted all the walls white immediately before the show.
Oh, right.
And everybody was leaning back against their coats were covered with paint.
Oh.
So you could just see they'd been there because they looked like ghosts. They were walking out. And there was always sort of somewhat an edge, somewhat a dialogue between the building and the stuff that was in there that didn't agree.
Yeah.
Like they were letting you in rather than saying, we welcome you.
Yeah.
Whereas this building seems actually to welcome it. It feels in tune with it.
For me, when we were first talking about the very beginning, it's a building full of layers, histories, presence, place. Everything is charged. So there's a natural. One of the reasons why I felt that when it was raised that it would work here implicitly was because it touched upon all of the key elements that don't need to be articulated. There's a natural resonance, an underlying resonance of which these works and the building correspond to each other. And of course in the Swedenborgian kind of universe, that correspondence is everything. And so rather than explaining it, here we have it. It's actually sort of living.
Correspondence is the key term, isn't it?
For Swedenborg, for sure,
Swedenborg.
and for what we do here it is as well.
And
But
what was revealed to me by being in the building and being able to have 3 chambers, like this one,
Yes.
which is
yeah,
a walking, breathing space where you
Yeah.
can think in the way you've said, this kind of quirkier, closer, contemplative space, and then the stairs as a bridging thing,
Yes.
and then the upper chamber, which is quieter and emptier and has
Yes.
more Swedenborgian resonance.
yes,
We were talking up there, and I kind of suddenly got this thing within the Swedenborgian universe that
yes,
the upper is the
Yeah.
more real, and the
Yeah.
people who are downstairs are the ghosts.
yes,
So essentially here we are,
Yes.
all of this activity is actually the ghostly. These
Yeah.
are the spectral things. That is a kind of higher form of reality, is up there with less
Yeah.
to see, but there
Yeah.
it is.
yeah,
And here is Swedenborg's bust, and here are these books.
yeah,
So putting
Yeah.
a little archive trace up there as like this is us, this was our life, this
Yeah.
is all gone.
yes,
It fitted beautifully, and,
Yes.
and the building just did it and,
Yes.
and gave me that sense, which is really quite a revelation.
and the thing that always strikes me about this building, and which again corresponded directly to the work, it kind of there's a displaced temporality. There's a displaced place. You come into Swedenborg House, and it is other. It's in the middle of the metropolis, surrounded by this corporate world, and then there's this place. And you walk in, and the first thing I noticed when I first came all those years ago, it sort of time slowed down. You walked in, and all of a sudden, everything worked at a slightly different temporal place.
I wondered if I'd ever get out.
Yeah.
The first time
Well,
I
you
came,
don't, but this is it.
and I never did get out.
No, people, they come, but they effectively never leave.
I
There's
mean,
a placement that never
what
goes away.
The other thing is the staircase when we go up. Renchi has presented that whole
Yes.
sequence of etchings which he taught himself, Blake Bunyan, and when he did it first, I said to him, this would fit in Swedenborg House. He
Yes.
said, yeah, it would. But, it wasn't there until now.
Yeah,
And the staircase is absolutely ideal. It's a
Yeah.
kind of spine that links the 2 spaces.
yeah,
And I see people go up the stairs very slowly, looking
Yeah.
at all the detail in that. And
Yeah.
he can't make any more. It's too complicated to do.
no.
So this is it. And it's here. Should we go tenants only? So we got the stairs. It is a pilgrimage to actually walk up the stairs. It's brilliant. I see people come very slowly up these stairs.
Yeah.
It's almost like completing the walk yourself. 12 panels, and it just fits.
Just
Perfectly.
perfectly. And there's the
And
final.
then the final.
Yeah.
So in
At the gates of
Swedenborgian
heaven.
terms, at the gates
Yes.
of heaven, how does this, in the idea of the correspondences, and how does that read?
It's always an internal move in Swedenborgian terms, and although the metaphors are always spatial or elevated, so we have the staircase and we go up, and in the Swedenborgian universe, any move upward is always a move inwards.
So it's like William Burroughs,
Yes,
essentially inner consciousness.
yeah.
The cosmos of the interior is
Yeah.
vaster than the
Than-
exterior.
Yes, very much so, yeah. But also just the references here to Bunyan and Blake.
Yeah, which carry me always back to Bunhill Fields.
Yes.
Where the two of them are
Yes.
right opposite each other.
That's right,
And
yes.
that great energising triangulation with Daniel Defoe.
Yes.
As we come to the end of the exhibition, really, we've ascended the stairs, we're into the Swedenborgian heaven, and this wonderful museum case, which would have appealed to Brian Catling, finds a copy of his book, The Stumbling Block, which is like a piece of written sculpture.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about that and its relation to this metal object?
Absolutely, I can try. It's so before the publication of the Vor, The Stumbling Block would probably have been Brian's calling card of his most well-known piece of prose, if you even want to call it prose, because it was initially thought of as an attempt to write sculpture. So The Stumbling Block itself, the actual full title of this is The Stumbling Block, its index. So this is just the index of an item, of the stumbling block. It's where it's described in 20 different ways, but the object itself is numinal. It doesn't quite exist.
It looks like a lump of slate.
Yeah.
I remember vividly the night he gave it to me. It had just been published, and we were in a pub called the Roebuck, which is now gone, near the site of the first Jack the Ripper murder. And he used to go there because it was full of old Maltese pimps and strange figures that could only exist in his fiction but happened to drink in that pub. And he pulled out this book, and I looked at it, and it was like the description that someone gave of Robert Macfarlane gave this description of a Steve Dilworth sculpture. It was a feather, put it in his hand, and his hand hit the floor.
Yeah.
The density of it was immense. The same with this book. It looks very slight, but it's full of fire. And
is it right that it also leaves a residue on your fingers?
Of course, leaves like...
So it kind of stains the books around it on the shelf.
Stains your fingers and your hand, but more than that, it stains your brain. And more than that still, there came a time making a film for The Late Show when Brian decided he wanted to melt this down. So he took all the font, everything that existed physically of the making of this magical book near the River Thames, and he melted it in a brazier, no health and safety, and he carried it in a ladle, staggered down the steps and poured it into the river. Very unecological. And there was this hissing, and this thing seemed to become a silver ball and disappear, which is where it sort of links to...
Well, this is where we come to the second item in the shelf, which we've chosen to nickname the Stumbling Bow, as opposed to Stumbling Block. So last summer, myself and a few of my friends, we did a walk sort of separate from any kind of research into Brian or anything to do with this exhibition. We just went on a walk led by Gareth Evans towards Mortlake, so walking along the Thames, and near Chiswick, near St Nicholas's Church, one of us, Sid Rosen, pulls this, what seems to be a piece of junk, out of the river, right by the church. And our initial feeling is that, well, put it back, it's probably got all sorts of diseases. But the more we held on to it, like, we couldn't get rid of it over the rest of the walk. And each time it kept being handed from person to person, and then one person put it up to their mouth and it became like a trumpet. One person thought it was like a bow. It kind of does look like a spine or a question mark or the number 3. And it just felt, like something that had its own kind of strange potency, whatever that might be. It wasn't a great leap to sort of suggest that maybe, and I think this might have been your suggestion, that this might be the residue. We might see it at least as the residue of that, the
stumbling
typeface.
block had moved upstream with the tide over the years, taken another form and re-emerged. What was it like? It's like the erstwhile. It's like Catling's creatures who bury themselves in mud. They're expelled of the Garden of Eden, and they emerge. They swim to the surface, and they've given it to the people who need it at the moment. And
well, it's like his sculptures, like the stumbling block itself, it invites multifariousness. It's an idea of a sculpture that you can't actually contain into a single
But do you think, in a way, this is something that forms a sort of neat conclusion to the tour that we've made through the past in this exhibition?
I think there is. There's a sort of, what I quite like about it is there's a playfulness to it, and I think there's a kind of playfulness that, to me at least, runs through this exhibition. There's a great, it's the Martin Rosen cartoon at the bottom but at the same time it's deeply serious. Like it's an emblem which we can on the one hand say, yeah, it's a piece of rubbish we pulled out, but every piece of rubbish has its trace, it has its history.
A posthumous prompt from Brian Catling himself, in the way that his sense of humour was such that he's landed you with this great lump of metal to carry home, which is actually junk, but it becomes something else by the way you've dealt with it?
I think so. In that same Three Sculptors film where he melts down the stumbling block, he talks about, you ask him actually about, with his performances, is there a danger that it kind of becomes a sort of weird vapid, pompous, exactly. It becomes too pompous if there's, there might be a sense of too much comedy in it. And his response is like, no, it's like you have to have an awareness of the seriousness and the lightness of it, and that's how you avoid pompousness. And to me, that's what this cabinet does. And I think it is this kind of wonderful sense of coming full circle, of tracing 50 years in these sort of two objects.
And seeing reflections in the library cabinets behind you of these Swedenborgian figures, these white marble figures. It's incredible, the layering of the ghosts that this building gives you the permission to draw on.
Yeah.
And that for me is the magic of this show. That had to happen here. It was a missing chapter of a series of events that had happened here with Brian Catling in the past. From Don't Eat Too Much, he eats a film. He eats the film. He eats the faces of the people who are in the show. Yeah. And then the next performance was Extreme Noise that made the whole building shudder. And downstairs, when we unwrapped this sword that he'd cast for me, which had been hidden away for many, many years, the roof of the building fell in. Yeah. And a painting of Jeremy Prynne in Cambridge crashed to the floor. So, the energies that are there in this quiet space are extraordinary.
Yeah. There's potency even behind the glass, can't contain it. It's been leaking out over the past few months.
So having made that journey into this heavenly emptiness, you just have a record of our lives and doings at the beginning in this archive collection. You have Victor Rees's lump of metal retrieved from the Thames, and you have Alan Fisher painting, which Alan was a poet and publisher, performer, activist at that same period in the 70s, and he wanted to kind of pay his homage to Brian, and he's written a poem which is published about the various times he tried to attend Brian performances. Yes. And so there's something from outside as the final thing, along with the great photos by Anonymous Bosch and Steve Dilworth's hooded crows, which he makes these incredible containers for, and the text he'd written, which is about the birds, that he put for a birthday book that Gareth Evans assembled for me. So there we are, right round. Yes. That's it.
And it's one of my favourite rooms in the building, but I do find in each of these, this is Swedenborg in every language. And so these points of connection, most of it is impenetrable, obviously, because linguistically it's inaccessible. But that makes it more interesting. It just allows for that. Cosmopolitan is the wrong word, but a kind of variety, or there's a layering that this room just absolutely enhances. It just, it draws it out.
Well, it's like in the corner there, you've got Renchi's sketch he did when summer solstice, which was the end of this whole setup, when we walked back to Pole Hill, long day's trudge from Greenwich, and found this hollow tree which seemed to have relics to do with Brian in it. And he made that sketch, and beneath it in the case are all of his recent sketchbooks, and so there's journeys we can't touch. They're all in there, but you can't see them. You don't need to see them. You just know there's huge. It's a bit like these other books in the cabinets. They're there. You get them by some other way. All you can see is this one. There's someone else in this cabinet with a cat there, the poet Chris Torrance,
Right.
because after he died, and he gave one of his last readings here, he was in the audience, I remember.
Yes.
And then after he died, they launched his book here. So sort of those connections go way, way back. Even every little thing. Here's Mr. Prynne's room in Cambridge. That's why I took. You couldn't take a photo of him. He hated. He would not be photographed. I daren't lift the camera and photograph him. So I just took his nameplate and respected his desire never to be photographed.
That's him, isn't it?
Yeah, that's him lurking in there. A bit like the one you took in the Swedenborg Don't Eat Too Much place.
Yes.
Where there's a kind of spectral thing and a staircase.
Yes.
Yeah. So the sort of our London exterior walk feels shorter than the interior walk.
Yes.
There's more space in here than there.
Yes.
That just seemed like 100 yards packed with incident.
Yes.
And then we come in here and it expands.
Yeah.
Doctor Who. Do you think Doctor Who is a Swedenborgian?
It could certainly be interpreted that way. I'm sure someone will write something about it. Oddly enough, there was, I don't know if you're ever familiar with a children's television programme, Mr. Ben?
Yes, well, I've heard of it.